In 356 BC, in the royal city of Pella, capital of the kingdom of Macedon, a son was born to King Philip II and his queen Olympias. The child was named Alexander. From his earliest years, he was raised in a court defined by military ambition, dynastic rivalry, and the constant pressure of a kingdom expanding its power across the Greek world. Around 346 BC, a powerful black warhorse named Bucephalus was brought before Philip II by horse traders. The animal was untamable. It threw every rider who approached. But young Alexander, observing that the horse was simply frightened by its own shadow, turned it to face the sun and mounted it with ease. His father, watching in astonishment, reportedly declared, "Son, seek a kingdom worthy of yourself, for Macedonia is too small for you." In 343 BC, Philip II hired the philosopher Aristotle to educate his son. For 3 years at the rural sanctuary of Myasa, Alexander studied under one of the greatest minds of antiquity. Aristotle taught him philosophy, medicine, rhetoric, and the natural sciences. Alexander would carry copies of Homer, annotated by Aristotle throughout his campaigns, and his intellectual curiosity would shape how he approached every civilization he encountered. In 338 BC, Philip II led the Macedonian army south to crush a coalition of Greek city-states. At the Battle of Chaeronea, 18-year-old Alexander commanded the elite companion cavalry on the left wing. His charge shattered the sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit that had never been defeated. While Philip held the center, the battle secured Macedonian supremacy over all of Greece. In 336 BC, Philip II was assassinated at the theater in Aigai during his daughter's wedding celebrations. He was stabbed by a Macedonian nobleman. Whether this was a personal grievance, a political conspiracy, or something more has been debated ever since. Within days, the 20-year-old Alexander was proclaimed king by the Macedonian army, inheriting a powerful kingdom and an unfinished war against Persia. Alexander moved with extraordinary speed. He suppressed revolts in Thrace and Illyria before marching south to meet a more dangerous challenge. The city of Thebes had revolted, believing reports that Alexander was dead. He was not. In 335 BC, Alexander's forces breached the walls of Thebes and reduced most of the city to rubble, selling its survivors into slavery. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The message reached every corner of Greece. The new king would not be tested. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army of roughly 40,000 men. He reportedly hurled a spear into the Asian shore from his ship, claiming the continent by right of conquest. At the Granicus River, his cavalry charged directly across the water against a combined Persian and Greek mercenary force holding the opposite bank. The victory opened all of Anatolia to his advance. As Alexander moved through Asia Minor, he liberated Greek coastal cities from Persian control and was welcomed as a liberator in many of them. At the city of Gordium in Phrygia, he encountered the legendary Gordian knot, a vastly complex knot tied to an ancient ox cart, bound by a prophecy. Whoever undid it would rule all of Asia. Alexander's solution was direct. He either cut through the knot with his sword or pulled the linchpin from the wagon. Either way, the knot was undone. In November 333 BC, Alexander met the full Persian royal army under King Darius III at Issus near the modern Turkish-Syrian border. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Alexander exploited a gap in the Persian line and drove his cavalry directly toward Darius himself. Darius fled the field in his royal chariot, abandoning his mother, wife, children, and the imperial treasury. It was a catastrophic humiliation and a decisive psychological turning point in the war. Rather than chase Darius immediately, Alexander turned south to secure the eastern Mediterranean coast. The island city of Tyre refused to submit. Alexander resolved to take it by force. With no fleet capable of a direct naval assault on the island, he ordered his engineers to construct a causeway extending nearly a kilometer from the mainland across the sea. After 7 months of siege in 332 BC, the walls were breached and Tyre was taken and destroyed. In late 332 BC, Alexander entered Egypt. The Persian governor surrendered without resistance, and the Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator from Persian rule. Recognizing him as pharaoh, he traveled to the remote oasis of Siwa to consult the oracle of the god Amun, where he was reportedly declared to be of divine descent, a claim he would encourage for the rest of his life. Before leaving Egypt, he founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast, which he named Alexandria. It would become one of the greatest cities the ancient world would ever know. In October 330 and October 331 BC, Alexander and Darius met again on the plains of Gaugamela in Mesopotamia, a site Darius had personally chosen to give his superior numbers room to maneuver. He had assembled the largest Persian army ever raised, including scythed chariots and war elephants. Alexander responded with a calculated oblique advance, pulling the Persian line out of position and then driving his cavalry through the resulting gap directly at the Persian center. Darius fled the field for the second time. The Achaemenid Empire had effectively fallen. After Gaugamela, Alexander captured Babylon, Susa, and finally Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire. In 330 BC, the great palace complex of Persepolis was burned. Ancient sources are divided on why. Some say it was deliberate retaliation for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Others describe it as a drunken decision made at a banquet. Whatever the reason, the destruction was complete. The seat of Persian imperial power was reduced to ash and ruins. Darius III did not survive to rebuild his empire. As Alexander's forces pursued him east, Darius was betrayed and murdered by his own satrap Bessus, who then claimed the Persian throne. When Alexander's scouts found Darius, he was dying on a roadside cart, abandoned by all who had served him. Alexander reportedly covered the fallen king with his own cloak and ordered a royal burial befitting a king, an act of calculated respect that also signaled his claim to be the rightful heir of the Persian throne. The conquest of Persia was not the end of the campaign. From 329 to 327 BC, Alexander pushed into Central Asia, the rugged highlands of what are today Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Unlike the pitched battles of Persia, this phase brought years of grinding guerrilla warfare. Local chieftains retreated into mountains and deserts, ambushed supply lines, and refused to submit. Alexander founded multiple garrison cities to hold the territory, but the region tested his army in ways no Persian army had managed. In 327 BC, Alexander married Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman. It was an unusual union. No Macedonian king had taken a foreign woman as his primary wife. To some, it reflected genuine attachment. To others, political calculation to stabilize the newly conquered region. It was also the most visible expression of a broader pattern. Alexander was increasingly adopting Persian and Eastern customs, incorporating Eastern nobles into his court, and presenting himself not as a Greek conqueror, but as a legitimate successor to the Persian throne. Alexander's adoption of Persian court customs created deep tension with his Macedonian companions. He began requiring those who approached him to perform proskynesis, a Persian gesture of prostration before the king that Greeks considered appropriate only for gods, not men. The court historian Callisthenes, a nephew of Aristotle, publicly refused and wrote critically of Alexander's conduct. When a plot by royal pages against Alexander's life was uncovered in 327 BC, Callisthenes was implicated. He was arrested and subsequently executed. An earlier and more personal rupture had already taken place. In 328 BC, during a banquet in the Central Asian city of Maracanda, Alexander fell into a drunken quarrel with Clitus, one of his most experienced generals, and a man who had saved his life at the Granicus. Clitus, angered by Alexander's dismissal of Macedonian traditions in favor of Eastern customs, made cutting remarks. Alexander, in a rage, seized a spear and killed him. He spent 3 days in anguished remorse, but Clitus was dead. In 327 BC, Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush Mountains and entered the Indian subcontinent, a region almost entirely unknown to the Greek world. He advanced through the Punjab, receiving the submission of some local rulers and fighting those who resisted. The landscape itself was a challenge. Dense monsoon forests, wide flood rivers, unfamiliar warfare, and the psychological weight of distance from home pressed on an army that had already been marching for 7 years. In 326 BC, Alexander faced the Indian king Porus at the Hydaspes River. Porus commanded a battle line that included war elephants, animals that terrified the Macedonian horses. Alexander crossed the flooded river by night in a wide flanking maneuver, drawing Porus into battle on ground of his choosing. After a hard and costly engagement, Porus was captured. When asked how he wished to be treated, he replied, "As a king treats a king." Impressed, Alexander restored Porus to his throne as a vassal ally. After the Hydaspes, Alexander pressed east once more, but at the Hyphasis River in the summer of 326 BC, his army broke. The soldiers had marched over 30,000 kilometers across 8 years. They were exhausted, far from home, and facing reports of vast kingdoms and larger armies beyond the river. For 3 days, Alexander appealed, argued, and retreated to his tent in silence. The army would not move. For the first time in his life, Alexander's will was stopped, not by an enemy, but by his own men. The return west proved as grueling as the campaign itself. In 325 BC, Alexander chose to lead part of his army through the Gedrosian Desert, a brutal route through what is today southern Iran and Pakistan. The march was catastrophic. Extreme heat, no water, and near total absence of food devastated the column. Thousands died along the route. Meanwhile, his admiral Nearchus navigated the Macedonian fleet from the Indus River back through the Persian Gulf, an extraordinary sea voyage with no reliable charts to guide it. In 324 BC, at Susa, Alexander organized a mass wedding ceremony unlike anything the ancient world had seen. He and nearly 100 of his senior officers simultaneously took Persian noblewomen as wives. Alexander himself married 2 women of Persian royal descent. The ceremony was conducted according to Persian custom. It was the clearest expression of his vision of a unified ruling class, an empire that would be neither purely Greek nor purely Persian, but something entirely new. Later, in 324 BC, Alexander's closest companion since childhood, Hephaestion, fell gravely ill at Ecbatana and died. Ancient sources describe Alexander as devastated beyond any previous grief. He reportedly lay with the body for an entire day, without moving. He ordered the manes and tails of all cavalry horses, cut as a sign of mourning, demolished the battlements of a nearby city in his anguish, and commissioned an enormous funeral pyre to be built in Babylon. Those who knew Alexander said he was never quite the same man again. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander was in Babylon making plans for further campaigns, possibly against Arabia. He attended a series of banquets and then fell ill over the following 11 days. His condition steadily worsened. By early June, he could no longer speak. When his generals came to his bedside, asking to whom he left his empire, he reportedly answered, "To the strongest." He died on approximately the 11th of June, 323 BC. He was 32 years old. The cause of his death remains disputed to this day. Alexander left no designated heir and no binding instructions. His generals, known as the Diadochi, meaning the successors, immediately began competing for control. What followed were decades of civil war that permanently fragmented the unified empire. It split into several successor kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire across Asia, the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia, and others. The empire Alexander had built across 13 years would never be reunited under a single ruler. Alexander died at 32, having never lost a battle. In 13 years of campaigning, he had overthrown the largest empire the ancient world had known, founded over 20 cities, and carried the Greek language and Hellenistic culture from the Mediterranean to the frontiers of India. The age his conquests created became the cultural bridge between classical Greece and Rome, and through Rome, the civilizations that followed. His legend was retold, reinterpreted, and transformed in every culture he touched. For more than 2,000 years, he remains, by any measure, one of the most consequential individuals in the recorded history of the world. And that's it. Thank you for watching. The next story is waiting for you right here. Subscribe so you're always the first to know. Thanks for being part of this story. See you in the next one.